Why would a young boy plot his murder using the internet? You won't believe the circumstances that led to 14-year-old John's stabbing, which started with a simple online chat room. Mark, John's own friend, who was 2 years older than him, stabbed him after Janet Dobinson, a British spy mistress with whom Mark had been conversing via the same chat room, asked him to carry out the task. But why would she make Mark stab his own friend? On June 29, 2003, just before 8 p.m., police arrived at the scene to discover John struggling with his life, bleeding to death from multiple stab wounds, one in the chest and the other in his abdomen. The stab had penetrated his kidney and liver, which prompted his gallbladder to be removed. As a result of this damage, blood gathered inside John's body cavity, preventing his diaphragm's movement and inhibiting his lungs' function. Before we continue, please quickly like and share this video. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our suspense-filled crime stories. Do you think John survived the ordeal despite being operated on twice? What circumstances may have resulted in this terrible situation? Continue watching to find out what happened. John had been coercing Mark to join a chat room for 6 months before he felt ready to commit the murder. The chat room was a website dedicated to teenagers in Manchester. John was an intelligent elementary school student who struggled with loneliness, depression, and confusion. He also had disagreements with his stepfather and classmates. As a result, he withdrew into the internet's virtual world and led a fantasy life. He made friends easily and started living a fictional life, quickly becoming out of control. However, to brainwash his new friend Mark, John created several fictitious characters and scenarios in the chat room that he created as a plot to have himself killed. Some of his sources of inspiration included the James Bond films, as well as the blockbuster action-adventure Men in Black. On the other hand, Mark was a college student who occasionally worked in a restaurant. His parents bought him his computer in 2002 to aid him with school activities. The two boys met in the chat room in February 2003 when John pretended to be a 16-year-old girl, Rachel, looking for a virtual relationship. Mark took it up, and the two began a lengthy online conversation. By March 2003, the two boys were still in continuous interaction, though Mark still thought John was a girl. Over time, in the chat room, John concocted a story that convinced Mark that he would murder someone with a terminal brain tumor. You will be shocked at John's intelligence and how he pulled the stunt that persuaded Mark to murder him. John grew increasingly connected to Mark and conversed with him while posing as the 16-year-old girl. They had lengthy conversations for months, some of which were sexual in tone and language. Mark allegedly masturbated in front of his video camera multiple times at the request of John's fictional characters. Mark fell in love with Rachel immediately after learning about the domestic abuse she had endured at the hands of her boyfriend, Kevin, who was another character played by John. However, all the attempts they made to meet in person failed because she gave the excuse that she was enrolled in witness protection. Nevertheless, John continued and began creating new chat room characters. He formed more than half a dozen fantasy personalities and played their roles in various scenarios in the chat room, and 4 of them were female. Janet Dobinson, a 40-year-old British spy mistress from London, was another character that he pretended to be. Acting as Janet, John contacted Mark in April 2003 and informed him that she was doing covert work for the British government. As they chatted, John told Mark to murder him, the guy with the brain tumor. He convinced Mark that the murder was a test to see if Mark could work as a secret agent. He went on to say that if he completed his mission, he would not only become a member of the British Secret Service, but would also receive £80 million, meet the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and receive sexual favors from the spy, Janet. Quite enticing. John had convinced Mark that he worked for the British Secret Intelligence Services, also known as MI6. However, Mark became very convinced after receiving his agent number, 47695, that he now had a license to kill During this lengthy period of online communication, John and Mark made plans to meet in person. However, with each passing day, Janet's fantasy in the chat room conversation grew wilder and more unbelievable. But Mark didn't question it. He was madly in love with her. Nevertheless, Mark was still convinced to carry out the spy's order to kill John when the conversation resumed on June 28th. The spy had told Mark to take John to the Trafford shopping center in Manchester and murder him there. "Could you stab someone?" Janet asked him. "I haven't really thought about it," Mark answered. "Well, think please," she wrote. "Okay," Mark replied. Janet informed Mark that John, a once valuable asset, had developed a brain tumor and needed to be murdered as soon as possible to end his misery. She continued by saying that if he did not complete the task, she would lose her job and jeopardize national security. Having been so infatuated with this woman, Mark agreed and quickly asked the spy again, "You want me to kill him?" "Yes," Janet replied. "And just leave him to die in the Trafford Center?" Mark asked. "No, stay with him," she replied. "And what do I do then? Get help?" Mark further asked. And Janet replied by typing, "Yes, I'll get help for you." To prevent Mark from being detained after stabbing John, Janet was the first person to arrive on the scene dressed as a detective. On Sunday, June 29, 2003, Mark and John got together and went to the Trafford Center to buy a kitchen knife. He collected cash from the vending machine, and they proceeded to shop where he told John to choose a knife. John chose a 6-inch Sabatier, and he paid for it. Mark later revealed that allowing John to select the knife himself would hasten his death and make it easier. As they made their way to the town center of Altrincham, Mark attempted to express his feelings to John by hinting that he might have something to do that day. John knew what it was, but he said nothing. A short while later, Mark stabbed John in the chest and in the stomach. He waited 20 minutes before calling the police based on the order that Janet had given him. Janet gave the order for the delay because it would have given John enough time to actually die. On that same day, police received a phone call from Mark shortly before 8 p.m. He told them that his best friend had been stabbed in a deserted alley off Altrincham's main street by an unknown assailant. Did Janet arrive on the scene to save Mark as promised? She didn't. Instead, real cops apprehended Mark, and his friend Josh was rushed to Wythenshawe Hospital in critical condition. When they began the investigation, the police discovered the intricate plot by examining John's computer. They saw that John was the mastermind behind everything, and that he was the personification of every character in that chat room. He was a puppeteer, pulling the strings while Mark performed the role of the puppet. They discovered that John had created the fantasy that resulted in his own murder. However, John survived the attack and spent a week in the hospital after receiving emergency treatment. Mark couldn't believe he'd been tricked when the case was revealed in court. What on earth had John been thinking, he wondered. Mark and John were not given their names. The court order kept their identities hidden because they were underage. Eventually, Mark was charged with attempted murder, while John was charged with inciting his own murder. John received a 3-year supervision order, while Mark got 2 years. Additionally, they were not permitted to meet again, and they were only allowed to use the internet under supervision, and never in chat rooms. Both boys were able to reflect more deeply on what they had done after their time in court. It was most likely just a phase, according to John. This is a sad and strange story, but it just goes to show how the internet can lead people to believe lies and misinformation. This is why you should tread cautiously when using the internet. Not all that glitters is gold. So, do you think John went too far with his fantasy, planning his own death at his age? Was he acting wisely or foolishly? Is it appropriate to let children that age use computers unsupervised? Please leave your thoughts in the comment section below. As always, thank you for taking the time to watch, and we'll see you in the next one.